Well, it is great to see everyone this morning. We have a nice full house, and it's good to be back with you after having been out for a couple weeks. We are back to studying about Job. We've been in a sermon series looking at faith through trials from the book of Job. And as we've been doing this, we've been talking a lot about suffering. We've talked about why suffering happens. We've talked about dealing with suffering and talked about some unhelpful friends when we're going through suffering. But when we're in the midst of suffering, when we're in that deep, dark place, we may feel like maybe God isn't powerful enough. You know, maybe we've been praying, we've been pouring our heart out to God, we've been expressing our concerns to Him, and the situation persists. We still have that suffering. We might start to feel like, well, maybe God isn't strong enough. Maybe He's not powerful enough. Or maybe when we get to that spot where we've been pouring our heart out and the situation hasn't changed, we might start to accuse God. We might start to say, how dare you let this happen, God? How dare you let me go through this suffering, this pain? And that's a dangerous spot for a Christian to be at. Because when we get to that spot, our faith starts to crumble. Our faith starts to erode away. And so, is God strong enough? Is God powerful enough? Well, today we are going to be looking at the fact that God's wisdom and power are unfathomable. And I love that word, unfathomable. It carries the idea of something being so big that we can't wrap our mind around it. We can't fully comprehend the vast scope of it. Now, we like to use words like God is omniscient or omnipotent, all-knowing, all-powerful. And we may connect with those phrases intellectually, but sometimes it's hard to connect with those ideas in our hearts. It's hard to wrap our emotions around those concepts. And so today we are studying a section where God speaks to Job. And God speaks to Job about His own might and power. And God describes His own might and power in ways that we can wrap our minds around, in ways that we can understand how far above us He is. What we're going to see as we go through these is we're first going to see God's power over the cosmos. We're then going to see God's power over and knowledge of animals. And finally, we're going to see that God's might, God's power is greater than the mightiest creatures. Now, as we go through this, what we're going to see is that no matter what's going on in our life, God is powerful. He is mighty. But as we studied a few weeks ago, we may not know all the details. And so we need to trust Him. Now, one quick caveat, we are going to be covering some concepts that are a little bit controversial, that there are questions about in some people's minds. So if you have questions about those things or want to discuss them further with me, I would be happy to discuss them with you after service. So let's jump in and let's look at let's look at God's power over the cosmos. Turn with me to Job 38. Job 38, starting in verse 1. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now gird up your loins like a man, and I will ask you, and you instruct me." What a statement, right? God is essentially challenging Job here. He's saying, okay, put on your big boy pants and stand up like a man. Putting it in modern vernacular. Now this is kind of harsh. God is being really direct. So why is God speaking so sternly to Job? Did Job finally sin? You know, throughout this book, we've been maintaining that Job was upright, that he hadn't sinned to bring this onto himself. So did he finally Did he finally sin? Well, to answer that, we have to go back to Job 31, 35 through 40. Job 31, 35 through 40. This is the last of Job's speeches. And Job says, "Oh, that I had one to hear me. Behold, here is my signature. Let the Almighty answer me, and the indictment which my adversary has written, surely I would carry it on my shoulder. I would bind it to myself like a crown. I would declare to him the number of my steps. Like a prince, I would approach him. If my land cries out against me and its furrows weep together, if I have eaten its fruit without money, or have cursed its owners, or caused its owners to lose their lives, let briars grow instead of wheat, and stinkweed instead of barley. The words of Job are ended. So Job, he gets pretty bold there. He accuses God of wrongdoing. He says, okay, God has mistreated me. I want to take my charge against God. And he states right there in verse 37 that like a prince, I would approach him. Okay, so he is getting really direct with God. Now the big question is, did he sin here? Well, at the end of the book, God accepted Job, but not Job's friends. God says, okay, I won't accept your prayers, but I'll accept Job's prayer. So did he sin or did he not sin? Well, there's a couple interpretations. The first one being that Job's statement was sinful, but that Job repented of the sin that he committed. We see in both Job 40, 1-5, and 42, 1-6, that he repents of his statements, he recants his statements. The other interpretation is that Job did not sin with this statement, but that God sternly rebuked him to prevent him from sinning. The idea there being that God didn't punish him, God spoke sternly with him, and you could think of a parent when your kid starts to get a little rebellious. They haven't yet broken a rule, right? But they're getting close to it. They're getting impetuous. They're getting impertinent. And you get stern with them. You lay down the law. They haven't crossed the line yet, but you lay it down for them. That's what God is doing. Now, I tend to lean towards that second part, the second interpretation, because when we're talking about if something is sinful or not, we have to be very careful to make sure that we can back up our statements with Scripture. And it's kind of questionable whether just being impetuous with God is counted as a sin, or if that's something that is getting close but not quite there. We could talk about that more if we wanted to, but I want to get on to God's statements. How does he handle Job? Well, he asks Job a series of rhetorical questions that Job cannot answer. The first one he asks is basically, where were you during the creation? Look at Job 38, 4-7. Job 38, 4-7. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who set its measure, since you know? Or who stretched the line on it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Okay, Job, where were you when the world was created? Of course, he wasn't anywhere. He didn't exist yet. He wasn't born yet. Only God was there. We see that God is the creator. No mere human has that power. Now, right there, we know this, right? Genesis, we've read this. But think about that. The God we serve is the God who spoke the universe into existence. That is absolutely phenomenal. You can't hardly wrap your mind around that. But God isn't done. He then asks Job, well, who controls the seas? Verses 8-11. Or who enclosed the sea with doors? When bursting forth it went out from the womb, when I made a cloud its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band, and I placed boundaries on it, and set a bolt and doors, and said, thus far you shall come, but no further, and here you shall your proud waves stop. Okay, Job, who did this? Well, of course, God did, right? God controls nature. No mere human has that power. Job said, I want to approach God like a prince. God says, okay, can you control the waves? Of course not. We can't control the water. But God's not done. He then asked Job, have you controlled the powers of nature? Verses 12-18. Have you ever in your life, there's a good question, commanded the morning and caused the dawn to know its place? Think about that. Can we stand up and say, okay, I think it's time for the sun to rise. Sun, get up here. No. God set that in motion, right? God's in control of that. Only God controls nature. We don't have that power. Now, as God goes through this, he now moves to knowledge. And he asks in verses 19 through 24, do you know the secrets of nature? I know I'm skipping some sections, but it's for the sake of time. He says, where is the way to the dwelling of light, and darkness, where is its place? That you may take it to its territory, and that you may discern the paths to its home. You know, for you were born then, and the number of your days is great. You see the sarcasm from God. Job wasn't born then. The number of his days is not great. God's being a little sarcastic with Job here. Have you entered the storehouse of snow, or have you seen the storehouse of the hail, which I've reserved for the time of distress, for the day of war and battle? Where is the way that the light is divided, or east wind scattered on the earth? So, okay, Job, do you know these secrets, these secret things of nature? Well, no, he doesn't. God knows all the secrets of nature. No mere human has that knowledge. Now, we can discover a lot, we can observe a lot, but no matter how much we observe of nature, there's still more that we discover we don't know. And I think that's one of the amazing things about God's creation. The more we discover, the more we find there's more to discover. They're never going to find the end of it. But God knows. God knows it all. God then asks Job, who controls the water cycle? 25 through 30. Who has cleft a channel for the flood, or a way for the thunderbolt, to bring rain on the land without people, or on a desert without a man in it, to satisfy the waste and desolate land, and make the seed of grass to sprout? Has the rain a father, or who has begotten the drops of dew? From whose womb has come the ice and the frost of heaven? Who has given it birth? Water becomes hard like stone, and the surface of the deep is imprisoned. You notice his statement there. Bringing rain on a land without people. You know, you're familiar with that old philosophical question, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? God's asking a similar one. Okay, rain falls in the desert where no one observes it. God does that. And you think about that. You know, our world that we see is kind of limited to what we experience, where we are right now. We don't really have cognizant awareness of exactly what's going on elsewhere in the world. God does, and he causes it to happen. He makes the rain to fall on land where there's no people, no one to observe it. The grass grows, the plants, they do their thing, animals live their lives without any input from any of us. God controls the water cycle. No mere human has that power. Again, we can observe it, we can watch it, we can see it, but he controls it. He then goes big. Can you control the movements of the stars? Verse 31 and following. Can you bind the chains of Pleiades, or loose the cords of Orion? Can you lead forth a constellation at seasons, and guide the bear with her satellites? Do you know the ordinances of heaven, or fix their rule over the earth? Now, we watch the constellations, we see the stars, but think about the sheer amount of power that it would take to move anything in space. I'm sure that someone could calculate it. I couldn't. God causes all of that to happen. There are processes going on in the universe that we don't even know are happening, and God controls them. His power, his knowledge is entirely unfathomable. God controls the movement of the universe. No mere human has that power. No human has that power. And God just keeps going. Can you control the ecosystem? So he goes from the universe back down to something that we can grasp. Verse 39 through 41. Can you hunt the prey for the lion, or satisfy the appetite of the young lion? When they crouch in their dens and lie in wait for their lair, who prepares the raven its nourishment? When the young cry to God and wander about without food. Okay, so maybe you can't control the universe, but can you at least feed the animals in your own backyard? I mean, sure, you might be able to go kill an animal and take it to a young lion, but what about all of them everywhere? We don't have that power, right? We don't have the power to make sure the birds have enough food. God controls the ecosystem. No mere human has that ability. Again, we can observe it. We might be able to impact it some, but God controls it. So God goes through this long statement of his power. But what impact does that have on our discussion about suffering? Why go through all the details here? Well, because this concept, reading through this, makes God's power, his knowledge, a little bit easier to grasp, a little bit easier to understand. If we say he knows everything, well, that's kind of abstract. But if we go through this detail and say, okay, he knows all these little details and he controls all these little details, then we can say, well, what about my life? Does he know what's going on in my life? Yes, he does. He does. Does he have power in our lives? Yes, he does. But like we studied a few weeks ago, we may not understand everything going on in the background. We may not understand the purposes or the reasons behind things. So what do we need to do? We need to trust God. Trust in him. Now, of course, the chapter breaks are not inspired. The chapter breaks were inserted there by people. So God continues in chapter 39, and we see God's power over and knowledge of animals. And he's going to mention some very specific animals here. First off, he asks, do you know when the elusive animals give birth? Chapter 39, 1 through 4. Do you know the time the mountain goats give birth? Do you observe the calving of the deer? Can you count the months they fulfill? Or do you know the time they give birth? They kneel down and they bring forth their young. Then they get up from their labor pains. Their offspring become strong. They grow up in the field. They leave and do not return to them. What a simple thing, right? Okay, we all know that wild animals give birth, right? We can even observe them and find out the period of their gestation. But do you know exactly when every mountain goat and every deer is going to give birth? No, we don't, right? That's something relatively simple. But we don't even know that. The only ones we could really tell that about is ones that are domesticated, and even then, you don't know the exact day. You know the time frame. See, God knows all the ways of every animal. No matter how elusive, no matter how secretive or private those animals are, God knows all the details. No mere human has that knowledge. Again, we can observe, but no scientist out there knows every way of every animal that's ever been. God does. He then asks Job, who made the wildest animals free? Verse 5 and following. Who set out the wild donkey free? And who loosed the bonds of the swift donkey? To whom I gave the wilderness for a home and salt land for his dwelling place? He scorns the tumult of the city, and shouting of the driver he does not hear. He explores the mountains for his pasture and searches after every green thing. So wild donkeys, these are different type of donkey than people domesticated. These are a particular type of donkey that lives in the Middle East that you can't really domesticate. They're extra difficult, I've heard, or read, I should say. Then he talks about, in verse 9, he says, will the wild ox consent to serve you? Or will he spend the night at your manger? Can you bind the wild ox in a furrow with ropes? Or will he harrow the valleys after you? Will you trust him because of his strength is great and leave your labor to him? Will you have faith in him that he will return your grain and gather it from your threshing floor? Now there's a little bit of a linguistic question here. In my translation, it says the wild ox. If you have the old King James, it says unicorn, which has caused a lot of people to question. And a lot of skeptics have said, see, the Bible talks about unicorns, it's not legitimate. Now there's a translation question here because they're not quite sure what animal this refers to. It literally translates as one horn or monohorn. So some have said, well, maybe it's a young ox that isn't trainable yet. It's just got little nubs. Some have said, well, maybe it's something like a Cape buffalo that looks like it's got one big horn. And again, you can't domesticate those. You can't use those to plow your field. Others have argued that it's something like a rhinoceros that has that big prominent horn. Again, you can't hook a rhinoceros up to a plow and have it plow your fields. The point that's being made here by God is that all these animals that humans can't even tame, He gave them that level of freedom. God gave freedom to the wild animals. No mere human has that power. Now, we may be able to domesticate some of them, but we can't even domesticate all the types of animals. Okay, Job, do you even have the power to set those animals truly free? Well, no. No, we don't. So then God moves to a type of animal that humans can exercise some level of control over. He says, did you give the horse their might? 19 through 25, he talks about the strength of the horse. He says, do you give the horse his might? Do you clothe his neck with a mane? Do you make him leap like a locust? His majestic snorting is terrible. He paws in the valley and rejoices in his strength. He goes out to meet the weapons. And it goes on and talks about how the horses will charge into battle. They'll run down enemy soldiers. And if you think about the ancient world, horses were like early tanks. The side that had the most horses generally won. And it'd be absolutely terrifying. Be a conscripted peasant with a sword being run down by a big war horse with a trained warrior on its back. That'd be terrifying. Now, humans can exercise some authority over horses. We can train them. But who made the horse strong in the first place? Well, God did. God gave powerful animals their might. No human has that ability. No human has that power. We might get proud of ourselves and say, hey, look, I tamed this wild animal and made it my servant. But God's saying, I beat you on that because I gave it that strength in the first place. Now God moves on to an animal that has fascinated humans for all of time, and that is birds. And God asked, did you teach birds to fly? Chapter 39, verse 26 through 30. Is it by your understanding that the hawk soars, stretching his wings toward the south? Is it at your command that the eagle mounts up and makes his nest on high? What a question, right? By your knowledge, do they fly? No. See, God gave birds the ability to fly. We can observe the way they fly, but we can't make them fly. We can't even create things that fly exactly like birds. We can create machines that do fly, but we didn't give birds flight. God makes all these arguments. God lays it out for Job. And then look at Job's response. Chapter 40. Job covers his mouth. Look at this. When the Lord said to Job, then the Lord said to Job, will the fault finder contend with the Almighty? Let him who reproves God answer it. Then Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am insignificant. What can I reply to you? I lay my hand on my mouth. Once I have spoken and I will not answer. Even twice and I will add nothing more. This is the right response to God's power. Job says, okay, I misspoke. I'm just going to. And honestly, this is a great lesson for us. Sometimes we just want to speak where we have no knowledge. We want to accuse where we have no authority. Sometimes it might be better for us to say, you know what? Sometimes it's better for us to not run our mouth. But God sees Job's statement here. I'm going to shut my mouth, says Job. But God is still addressing Job's arguments. So God asks Job, can you face God as an equal? Then the Lord answered Job out of the storm and said, now gird up your loins like a man. We've seen that twice now. I will ask you and you instruct me. Will you really annul my judgment? Will you condemn me that you may be justified? Or do you have an arm like God, and can you thunder with a voice like his? Of course not. Of course Job can't do that. Adorn yourself with eminence and dignity, and clothe yourself with honor and majesty. Pour out the overflowing of your anger, and look on everyone who is proud and make him low. Look on everyone who is proud and humble him, and tread down the wicked where they stand. Hide them in the dust together, bind them in the hidden place. Then I will also confess to you that your own right hand can save you. So Job made that accusation that he wanted to stand before God like a prince. And God says, you can't stand toe-to-toe with me. Go ahead, try. No human could do that. See, God has ultimate wisdom and power, and no human has the power to face him as an equal. Now, this, honestly, is where our modern society will often fall on its face. Because the world has told people, you are a god. The world has told people that your feelings are law. The world has told people that you are the most important thing in the universe. And they bring that thought to religion and they say, well, how dare God do something different than what I would do? How dare he handle a situation different than I would handle it? Now, we need to fully understand this concept that we can't stand toe-to-toe with God. We do not have equal power, authority, or wisdom to God. We can't scratch the surface of his power and his might. All we can do is stand in awe of it. So we best not be standing up and trying to go toe-to-toe with God. Now, going along with this, though, God then has one final big section to communicate to Job. And we see God's power is greater than the most powerful creatures. And this is where, like I said, things get a little controversial depending on your point of view. So before we jump into the text, I want to give some contextual notes so that we understand what we're looking at. First off, the preceding context references actual animals. Ostriches, ox, donkeys, horse, real, actual animals. And God is making a point about his power and his authority. Therefore, mythical creatures would not make that point. It'd be like me saying, hey, I beat up Darth Vader, so I'm strong. Darth Vader's not a real thing. That doesn't prove my strength at all, right? If God were speaking of mythical creatures here, that wouldn't prove anything. Thus, this section refers to literal animals that Job was familiar with. Okay, let's now talk about Behemoth. Chapter 40, starting in verse 15, behold now Behemoth, which I made as well as you. He eats grass like an ox. Behold now his strength is in his loins, and his power is in the muscles of his belly. He bends his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are tubes of bronze. His limbs are like bars of iron. So Behemoth is a herbivore, eats plants, very, very powerful body, has a tail like a cedar, and that's going to be important in just a minute, and has extremely strong bones. God goes on and says, he is the first of the ways of God. Let his maker bring near his sword. Surely the mountains bring him food, and all the beasts of the field play there. Under the lotus plants he lies down, in the covert of the reeds in the marsh. The lotus plants cover him with shade. The willows of the brook surround him. If a river rages, he is not alarmed. He is confident, though the Jordan rushes to his mouth. Can anyone capture him when he is on watch? With barbs, can anyone pierce his nose? So we learn that this creature is large enough to be unconcerned by a raging river. That's pretty powerful and cannot be controlled. You can't domesticate this thing. Now, some have read this description and think that it could refer to a hippopotamus or an elephant. They're big, they're powerful, they sometimes will hang out in water, but there's a big problem with this. Neither has a tail like a cedar. I mean, they both have tails, yes, but they're not like a cedar. A cedar is a tree that is massive and big around and very tall. Those tails don't look like cedars. So what animal has a tail like a cedar? Well, quite frankly, there aren't any animals now that we could point at that have a tail like a cedar. So various types of dinosaurs, though, fit the description of Behemoth. Now, at this point, this is where we get to the controversial part, because people who have a evolutionary worldview look at this and they say, well, dinosaurs lived billions of years before people, and no humans and dinosaurs ever interacted, and so therefore this must be fantasy. But we read in Genesis, God created the heavens and the earth in 6 literal days. And that includes all the animals. So therefore, dinosaurs and people did live at the same time period. So it makes sense that God would use a dinosaur as a demonstration of his power and might. But he's not done. Chapter 41, he talks about Leviathan, and this is where things get really interesting. He says, can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook, or press down his tongue with a cord? Can you put rope in his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many supplications to you, or will he speak to you in soft words? Will he make a covenant with you? Will you take him for a servant forever? Will you play with him as with a bird, or will you bind him with your maidens? Will the traders bargain over him? Will they divide him among the merchants? Can you fill his skin with harpoons or his head with fishing spears? Lay your hands on him. Remember the battle, and you will not do it again. Behold, your expectation is false. Will you be laid low even at the sight of him? No one is so fierce that he dares to arouse him. Who then is he that can stand before me? Who has given to me that I should repay him? Whoever is under the whole heaven is mine. We're going to come back to verses 10 and 11 in a minute. What we see here, though, is that Leviathan cannot be caught, could not be tamed, has tough, armored skin. But then we keep reading. I will not keep silence concerning his limbs, or his mighty strength, or his orderly frame. Who can strip off his outer garment? Who can come within his double mail? Who can open the doors of his face? Around his teeth there is terror. His strong scales are his pride, shut up as with a tight seal. One is so near to another that no air can come between them. They are joined one to another. They clasp each other and cannot be separated. So his skin is like armor. It's like chainmail that's knit together so tight that you can't get a weapon in there. Verse 18, his sneezes flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. Out of his mouth goes burning torches, sparks of fire leap forth. Out of his nostrils smoke goes forth as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame goes forth from his mouth. Okay, what did we just read there? We read that he breathes fire. Now again, a lot of people look at that and they say, well, that's incredibly fantastic, almost seemingly impossible. We're going to get to that explanation in a minute. And there'll be more things on the slide when my phone decides to work for me. We go on and we read verse 22. In his neck lodges strength, and dismay leaps before him. The folds of his flesh are joined together, firm on him and immovable. His heart is as hard as stone, even as hard as a lower millstone. When he raises himself up, the mighty fear, because the crashing they are bewildered. The sword that reaches him cannot avail, nor the spear, the dart, or the javelin. He regards iron as straw, bronze as rotten wood. The arrow cannot make him flee. Sling stones are turned into stubble for him. Clubs are regarded as stubble. He laughs at the rattling of the javelin. His underparts are like sharp pot shards. He spreads out like a threshing sledge on the mire. He makes the depths boil like a pot. He makes the sea like a jar of ointment. Behind him he makes a wake to shine. One would think the deep to be gray-haired. Nothing on earth is like him, one made without fear. He looks on everything that is high. He is king over the sons of pride. That is quite the description, isn't it? So we see that he has these fierce teeth. He breathes fire, is aquatic or at least semi-aquatic, and nothing on earth is like him. Now that is an incredible description. Now some people have looked at this and said, okay, well maybe it's a crocodile. You know, we've discovered skeletons of some pretty big crocodiles. But let's talk about the crocodile for just a minute. Well, a crocodile can be caught. It's said that Leviathan could not be caught. Crocodiles can be cut by spears. In fact, you can find videos from Florida of people doing that. They do have fierce teeth. I wouldn't want to be caught in their teeth, but they don't breathe fire. That would be a pretty terrifying crocodile if it breathed fire. They are aquatic and semi-aquatic, but there are also other things on earth like them. So we see in this that crocodiles do not fit the description of Leviathan. They just don't fit. So what animal does fit the description? Well, quite frankly, some sort of aquatic or semi-aquatic dinosaur fits the description. But then someone says, well, what about the breathing fire part? And to answer that, we simply have to say there's a lot about dinosaurs that we don't know. There are animals that are on Earth now that do combine chemicals to make heat and small explosions. So there's nothing to say that there couldn't be dinosaurs that did breathe fire. We just have the bones and don't necessarily have all the internal organs to know exactly if that, what kind of dinosaur exactly that would be. Now, if you have questions about this, feel free to talk to me afterwards. I've got more information on it, but for now, we want to ask the question, what is the point of these animals being described? Why is God discussing in such great detail these specific animals? And the answer is because God created these fierce creatures. And no mere human has that power. Go back to chapter 41, verses 10 and 11. No one is so fierce that he dares arouse him. And then God says this, who then is he that can stand before me, says God? Who has given to me that I should repay him? Whatever is under the whole heaven is mine. So God says this is a creature that you can't hope to control, that you can't hope to even catch, much less domesticate, and it belongs to me. Not only did God make it, it belongs to God. The point is that no human can hope to stand before God as an equal. Job made that accusation to God. Job said, I want to stand as a prince before God. And God is saying, listen, you don't have an inkling of the power to be able to come and stand before me as an equal. So trust in God. Now Job, he gets it. For chapter 42, 1 through 6, Job retracts his statements and he repents. Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do all things and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. And then he quotes God, who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? And he responds, therefore I've declared that which I do not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. Then he quotes God again, hear now, and I will speak. I will ask of you, and you instruct me. And he responds, and he says, I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I retract and I repent in dust and ash. Job got the message. God is so powerful. God is so mighty. God is so beyond fathoming that none of us can stand and accuse God on an equal footing. And that's really the lesson that all of us should get from this. We don't have the power and authority to accuse God. Life gets hard sometimes. We face suffering. We face pain. And we may not understand why we go through those things. That doesn't give us the right to accuse God of wrongdoing. Instead, we should stand and trust in him. So today, as we've been discussing the fact that God's wisdom and power are unfathomable, we've seen his power over the cosmos, we've seen his power over and knowledge of animals, and we've seen that he is more powerful than the mightiest of animals. My friends, God is more powerful and wise than we can imagine. We serve a God who is so far beyond our understanding, our comprehension, and that's comforting. It's comforting because he has power we do not. He has the ability we do not. So my friends, by way of application, stay faithful to God, especially when you feel like the situations are too much for you. You're facing suffering, you're facing trials, you're facing hard times. Stay faithful to God. He has the power. He has the knowledge. He is the one that we need to go to. Now today, as we close, if you have a need, maybe you are going through a time of suffering or trials, we want to be here for you. Maybe you're living in sin and need to repent of that. Maybe you need to become a Christian in the first place. We want to be here for you. We want to help you with that. So in just a moment, we'll have our invitation song. And when we have that song, I encourage you, come up to the front, and one of the elders will come speak with you. If you have a need, please let me know as Bob leads us in this invitation song.